Yes, do you hear me?
All good.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Nacho. I really thank the organizers for giving me, but on behalf of all the team, that the work of which are presented here to present these few slides that were prepared only a few days ago on a short time. So please, I hope that won't be too messy. So hello everyone. I will present you those work made by the ET modeling team here listed. And this work was done in collaboration with the main colleagues listed here at the University Hospital of Montpellier, at the CERBA Laboratory Network, University Hospital of Paris, but also Olivier Thomine that founded the Epidemia Project, the Société Française de Microbiologie. We had some support from the Région Occitanie that rescued us from the ANR, and logistical support from the ITROP Bioinformatics at the IRD and the Institut Français de Bioinformatique. So, as you remind, we participated 14 months ago on a previous SEM. We were in our outreach phase about the estimation of the pace of the ongoing epidemic in France that translated weeks and months after into a more serious, deeper, and importantly, everyday work on many aspects of this pandemic, not only at the between host level, but also at the within host level. And so the works I will present you reflect somehow the knowledge of the moment, that the works were not made at the same time with the same literature that is now absolutely massive. We don't know everything, of course. We haven't read everything, so that's on its own a big challenge to handle this literature, along with the fact that we have to work, improve the analysis, the models with the limited support. So basically, the outline of the presentation will go along this somehow chronology. On the background, you see the daily new confirmed death worldwide attributed to the COVID-19, so the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus that emerged that was detected in December 2009 in China. And the three parts will try to cover three main axes of the team research. The first one, that is the estimation of the pace of the epidemic, characterizing the dynamics quantitatively. Then to analyze the effect of public health prevention measures, better known as non-pharmaceutical interventions, and the last part will be focused on the game changers, that means the variants and vaccines, and talk a little bit about how the end of the epidemic could look like. I won't spend much time on these introductory elements, as you know those figures and data, you see them every day. The COVID-19 pandemic is now going for 1 year and a half, with a death toll that exceeds those of influenza pandemics, except the Spanish flu, but doesn't have yet the potential of the Spanish flu death toll. But this is really big, almost 3.5 million of deaths attributed to COVID-19. But of course, there is some underreporting. Why did COVID-19 become a pandemic? Usually in the textbook, you see the infectious diseases are characterized by two axes: contagiosity, quantified by the basic reproduction number or not, and lethality or pathogenicity, but lethality, either the case fatality ratio or the infection fatality ratio, newly introduced for this COVID-19 because of very mild underreported cases. So here lies the COVID-19, depending on which strain we are talking about. So basically in the good corner of the graph, well, but still this disease caused a major and a major pandemic with a start that was that astonished the whole world. And why? Because the third axe that is usually not represented in those textbooks, but here very well highlighted by Christophe Fraser and colleagues in 2003, this axis, that is the proportion of infection that occur prior to the symptoms or associated with asymptomatic infection. That means that theta here is the potential to be uncontrolled by quarantine measures. And here we have a quite big number, between 40 and 50% of transmission events that occur in non-symptomatic situations. The problem is that this was not the case for SARS-CoV-1, the one causes the SARS infection in 2003 that vanished in a few months with less than 1,000 deaths. The clinical history of SARS is the same as COVID-19, but the infectious status is behave completely differently, because the latency period, that means the time before reaching contagiosity, is much shorter, and the most importantly is shorter than the incubation period, so that there is this pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic phase during which infections can occur. For the rest of the talk, we will need one main notion that was exposed last year as well, that is the serial interval. In fact, what we need to assess the timing, the rhythm of an epidemic, how to calibrate the events in time so that to reconstruct the transmission chain, the incidence temporal time series, is to have the generation time. The generation time is the time between two contaminations within the transmission chain. This time, nobody knows it. It's very difficult to document. But what is trivial is that if you shift on average the events, you don't look at the contaminations, but at the symptom onset for infector-infectee pairs of symptomatic cases, then the expectation of G is the same as the expectation of S. So that if you can document the symptom onset of infector-infectee pairs, you can reconstruct here a proxy distribution of the generation time. So that's one of the distribution we use, and you see that usually the peak of contagiosity occurs before the symptom onset that occurs 1 or 2 days after that. So globally, the mathematical epidemiology relies on the fact that each contagious infectious individual can contaminate a certain number of secondary cases with expectation R, the reproduction number. Because it's a count process, we can view it as a Poisson process. We can add some heterogeneity, therefore it's a negative binomial process. And the occurrence of contaminations are distributed according to the generation time that is approximated by the empiric serial interval distribution. Therefore, because the contagious period doesn't last only 1 day, there is an overlap of infectious generation. Thus, if we want to reconstruct, to decompose, in fact, the incidence dynamics, we have to address the fact that there are some overlapping generations, and each time there is two processes at work. First one is the number of secondary cases per primary case or index case, and the time at which the transmission occurs. So to solve this problem, we so the main question was, what is the current dynamic of the epidemic? This at the first weeks of the epidemic in France, at least when we realized there was an epidemic, now a big outbreak going on. And therefore, at each time step of interest, so how to measure it, with which data, can we trust those data? What are telling us besides the fact that these are the detection data? And can we detect recent changes in those time series? So here are the people that mainly contributed to this axis, and we used classical mathematical epidemiology on hospital data, statistical analysis for RT-PCR data, and phylodynamics on viral sequences. So there will be few equations, but this is very important, so I kept that one. If we say that beta T is the number of contamination caused on the 10th day of infection of an index case, then each day we have some beta tau infections, and the sum over the all times are the reproduction number of that particular index case. If we divide this sum by R, therefore we have 1, and thus the W tau, so those beta tau divided by R, defines the generation time distribution. That means that we can see it as a sequence of probabilities. Therefore, if we have some incidence y at time t, we know it, and we know the incidence, the daily incidences, the new cases each day at the previous times, then we can write this equality, because it satisfies the fact that the incidence we observe at time t is the consequence of those infected the day before times the number of contamination that on day one of the infection, and so on. And we can write it as a weighted sum of the generation time distribution times the reproduction number. Therefore, it's simply here by dividing here, we get an estimator of the reproduction number at time t. But importantly, one have to remind that an epidemic, that this is a measure of contagiosity only. There is no time aspect involved, but it means that an epidemic grows if and only if R is greater than 1. If we want to scale it on absolute time, then we have to introduce the doubling or halving time, depending on the trend of the epidemic. And so we have to introduce, to make the assumption that we have the asymptotic behavior, and this comes from the Euler-Lotka equation. Well, one thing that is important is that this holds even when you sample the cases. That if you have the same sampling probability each day, at least for the duration of one infection cycle, then the estimates remain are robust to that. So that's why we can at the same time use hospital time series to assess the reproduction numbers. Here are the outputs of the software developed by Bastien René, available online since April 20. And here are the latest compiled outputs. So on last day, what we can see for sure, because the events of detection of the cases do not occur at the same time in the natural history of the disease, we have some delay. So now we only see what happened 1 week ago for the cases, 2 weeks ago for hospitalization and ICU admission, intensive care units admissions, and 1 month before for the 3 weeks before for the death. So now we can see that we start to see some trend here upwards that corresponds to the reopening of the schools for the primary schools on late April. Detection is done. Detection of cases is done on RT-PCR. SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA positive single-stranded virus, and we use the technique of RT-PCR is used for amplifying the viral material, genetic material that is not exactly a direct measure of the viral load, because for this virus, the genomic material that can be amplified is not only that is used for replication and therefore for transmission, but also that is expressed as for transcription and therefore for the infection itself. So that's why there is no direct link between the cycle threshold, that is the quantitative outcome of the RT-PCR, and the viral load. Still, there is some information that can be gathered when we look at very large data sets and compare CT value distributions between time points, because depending on somehow the age pyramid in terms of infection ages, we can have trends that are associated with the ongoing dynamics of the epidemic, because the higher the replication and the expression, so the higher there is a peak in infection and generally in infectiosity, contagiosity of the virus, the lowest the cycle threshold. You don't need to make too many cycles to amplify the genomic material. Therefore, this lower CT values denote young infections, so an increasing epidemic. This was assessed by the approximately 2 million RT-PCR given from the CERBA laboratory database, where we can see some interesting trends, for example, in age and sex of the host, as well differences between genes, and some relation between the estimated cycle threshold and the reproduction number. Therefore, Christian Sillinger in the team succeed into adding this information, this signal on the CT distribution to predict the next time steps of the reproduction number, adding the information on the distribution of the CTs, so that we can detect recent changes in terms of general population circulation of the virus. The last type of data that can be used for quantifying the dynamics of the epidemic is the viral sequences. In France, the sequencing was interesting at the beginning, and then it was quite outcompeted by other countries, such like United Kingdoms. But these viral sequences keep track of the history of the transmission chain, and therefore the history of the transmission network that can be reconstructed by phylogenetic methods, so computationally, and for example can address the weight of super spreading events, so massive transmission events starting from only one index case, and applying phylodynamics to the first sequences of SARS-CoV-2 in France allowed the team to date the beginning of the wave, so the initiation of the wave. That is not the first time the virus was introduced in France, in late January approximately. So after the epidemic started, some important measures were implemented in order to avoid the overload of intensive care units, so that the mortality within the hospitals would not skyrocket because, for example, of late care or no more bed availability. Those measures, especially social distancing, were more generally worded as non-pharmaceutical interventions, and many questions in mid-March, when most of the world went on lockdown, were how is this big and very stringent measure working on the transmission? Is it really efficient? Could we do otherwise? Could we rely on herd immunity? And once we entered that lockdown, can we then anticipate the hospital capacity strain in terms of date, in terms of height? And of course, can we, if there are further epidemic rebounds, can we improve those NPIs in terms of nature of or implementation? So we use for that classical epidemiological models, but translated into an original framework that is non-Markovian, and we go back to that, detail this, and also optimal control theory, mainly used by Marc Choisy, Ramses, and Quentin. As for the as we wanted to assess the effect of the NPIs, we first had to reconstruct the epidemic curve to see how these, if the hospital data that are only a very small fraction and delayed reflection of the epidemic, how these hospital data can reflect, how this reflects what's going on in the general population, and therefore from the dynamics and the trends of hospital data, how this can be translated into a signal on the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the goal was to first take hospital data, try to reconstruct the prevalence that is much higher, and the peak of which occurs weeks before, and the reproduction number that is unknown, and that show shifts that are discontinuous, unlike the ones that can be estimated from the previous methods. So we developed a discrete time modeling framework. Why discrete time? First of all, because the data are on a daily basis, and second, because it allowed us to take into account the fact that the waiting times are not exponentially distributed, are not memoryless. So the principle of the model is that a susceptible host can be contaminated in the general population, either being a non-critical, that means that it will not die, nor going to ICU during its infectious, during her or his illness, and will recover. The very small fraction of the hosts that will be that will develop critical infections will either die outside of ICU or will be admitted into ICUs and there will die or recover. This is important. We focused on the ICUs because this admission in ICUs were the most stable sampling pattern and with the homogeneity during time. This was very important to have the stationarity I introduced a few slides before. And it didn't change during the pandemic or on a very small scale. I won't show you all the equations, but what was original is the new definition of the force of infection because of the discrete time constraints, where we introduced the contact ratio, an important thing to assess the NPIs. And we structured all the model according to age classes with the arbitrary age cutoffs, so that we could assess what happened for each age class and investigate, for example, age-specific NPIs. Very early in the pandemic, we could estimate quite well the basic reproduction number, the lockdown effect, and the initiation time of the epidemic here in line with the previous works on late January. We can see here that based only on data available up to April 7th, we could predict quite well the end of the first wave over the whole lockdown period. Here is here are the curves, either incidental or inertial. That means here the currently bed occupied by COVID-19 patients in ICUs nationwide. So here with all the data on the lockdown period, for comparison purposes, here what a Markovian, that means a memory-less model, would have done. It was unable to capture, the best fit was unable to capture the short-term dynamics. This is due to the fact that here, when we assume a classical ordinary differential equations, all the waiting times are distributed like this. For example, here the time to hospitalization, while we know that the hospitalization peaks at 14 days after the beginning of the infection. Hence the big differences between those two curves. Building such a framework could therefore assess the potential of the epidemic in absence of any public health response, but as well investigates what is called counterfactual scenarios, where the things happen in other way. For example, we could assess that if the first lockdown occurred 1 week before, this could have saved 13,000 lives, but 1 week after, more than 50,000 lives would have been claimed. And this is an important result. That means that the impact of the delay for responses, public health responses, translates exponentially in terms of health burden, and not only on deaths, but also on ICU bed occupancy, and for all the consequences, for example, MyCovid that turns into a post-acute COVID-19 syndromes, but as well on economic, because of the delay. Then the delay translates as well on a longer time to come back to a manageable situations in terms of incidence. The shorter the earlier you respond, then the earlier you can get out from the measure. This was also assessed by Bastien René, on the aged care facilities of the Hérault department. He showed on the data set provided by the University Hospital of Montpellier that we clearly see here that the delay in mask wearing increased the secondary attack rate within those facilities. So this is another point that even at the local scale, the time of response has large consequences in terms of cumulative incidence and therefore morbid mortality. Here is the way things went in France from the ICU point of view. We show that shifting the strategy on a national and so nationwide and late response basis induced a very high incidence and occupation level after October, and without trying to use the benefits that were well documented by that time in the literature of the early responses and as well especially differentiated policies. So alternative scenarios, for example, could have been that that was mentioned quite early in the epidemic in France to control, for example, only the elderly. Well, we show that this has a limited leverage unless we control them very, very stringently. Therefore, the control must be there must be some share of the control over the whole population. We also, but I'm running out of time. We also assessed what was never explored: partial periodic lockdowns, unless some weeks on the weekend lockdowns. Showing that we could, for example, during one lockdown, alleviate, allowing 1 day, for example, of release with a limited impact of the epidemic. Well, one important result that was never published, following Neil Ferguson's team at Imperial College, the very famous now Report 9, was that the threshold at which a lockdown, for example, is triggered has no consequence on the time spent outside of the lockdown, all other things being equal, but only on the mortality. This means that shorter but earlier lockdowns would have done a better job in limiting morbid mortality. But what was not addressed by the model is that we could have reached very low incidences that could have been managed perhaps better by testing, trace, and isolate strategy. Ramses and Quentin investigated the application of optimal control theory on a more detailed model with continuous time, absolute time, and continuous age of infection, and showed that the optimal control solution, for example, of NPIs would have been to, it's always a response that occurs very early, that starts early and strongly, and therefore vanish, and after vanishes depending on the economic and psychological any kind of measure that can be seen as a cost, depending on the cost. For example, if the cost is low, the control could be maintained for a higher period on the youngest, on the medium age, for example. But this clearly shows the pattern that a response must be quick and strong and can be alleviated after. And depending on the cost, it can be more or less focused on the elderly. Now, a few minutes to talk about the game changer. So what are the short and long-term consequences of the variants and the vaccines? Try to estimate the transmission advantage of the variant. Try to look at the vaccine rollout in terms of expectations, and some thoughts about the evolution at the end of the pandemic. We here use the same tools. We have for sure more population genetics and adaptive dynamics theory occurring, but it's quite elementary, as for population geneticists, is when we have a variant spreading into an ancestral resident population, here viral population, assuming constant fitness, the solution, the trajectory of the relative frequency in new cases follows a logistic growth. And we quite early in mid-February estimated the relative advantage in transmissibility of the pooled three main variants circulating in France of about 50%. It was refined a few weeks later and distinguished between the V1.7 and with an advantage of 40%, and for the two others plus 27%. This is essentially the one called the Brazilian, the South African variant. This transmissibility increase can be related to differences and lower CT values. The amazing work of Baptiste Dely on this very recent and preparation work on CT values, especially in terms stratifying by the variants, show that this difference in CT values can be translated into difference in transmissibility, allowing a link with the infectivity peak, so the within-host dynamics. And because this is related to the age of known in our database of the host, the effect is higher for older age pyramids. So this advantage in transmissibility depends of the demography. Corentin Bonnec developed a local version of the discrete time model that can be used and is available online since February to predict the short-term dynamics at any departmental and regional level in France, that now includes vaccination. And so is based on the Bayesian estimates of the reproduction number based on hospital data. So here the good point is, for example, in Hérault, the decrease, yet a little bit saturating, of the ICU admissions. We still use the first model to make scenarios projections, assuming a quite optimistic vaccine rollout based on the doses delivery tables provided by the government. We, for example, here reaching almost 90% of the adult population vaccinated during July. If nothing changes at all, we have a very good PZO summer. But if we have gradual but still important alleviation of barrier gestures on June 30, when almost many measures will be alleviated, then a rebound is possible by the end of July, and this very pessimistic scenario shows that even in the presence of a good vaccine coverage, there is a potential for a rebound that threatens once more the hospitals. Thomas Beneteau and Baptiste investigated the time that could take to make the epidemic extinct under lockdown with some alleviations, and in all scenarios, this is a stochastic modeling with including super spreading. So this is a whole new framework. We can see that this time would be quite long. We should have to wait for several months to see the epidemic extinct, even with countermeasures maintained. The work of Olivier Thomine, sorry for the picture here, was quite impressive, as he developed a platform that modeled each French individual. So it's an agent-based model with mobility kernel instantiated every day that could assess the spatial spreading at a very very small, very high resolution of the metropolitan France. And this interesting approach shows that, in fact, only the densely populated areas will be the more at risk after the vaccine would be deployed, because here we see that this is the herd immunity threshold predicted by the mean field, that is homogeneous mixing theory. And we see that the assumption, so we see that most of the towns and cities are here and would have in a rural and in the countryside will be quite protected, but here for the big cities in France, the vaccine coverage will still be difficult to reach in terms of preventing a rebound. Bastien René developed recently, so this is ongoing work on the vaccine rollout with an age of infection, an age host age structure with partial differential equations. This can, for example, take into account the fact that even recovered individuals are vaccinated, and that there is some differential susceptibility and transmissibility, and depending, he can show that depending on the pace of relaxation of the measures, there is still a possibility for a moderate rebound after the alleviation. And this model, because it's non-Markovian, can be very interesting for the next weeks and months in order to assess the fine patterns of vaccination. One of the very recent works with the RT-PCR database is the fact that in some regions, in particular in Île-de-France and Hauts-de-France, there is a shift in transmission advantage of the V2 and marginally V3 variant. V2 is known for immune escape, and now it has been estimated to have this higher transmissibility compared to the B117 variant. This may be explained by an immune breakthrough in those regions that have been more than the others confronted to the disease. Finally, there are still some questions about how the virulence that is not the virulence of COVID-19 is not going now towards low levels, but the other way. This can be due to non-equilibrium dynamics for sure, but also maybe for the fact that the SARS-CoV-2 can be maladapted. One reason for that, for example, is the fact that the pathogenicity occurs after the transmission peak, for example. As well, Samuel investigated the fact that for milder coronaviruses that cause a common cold, for example, OC43, that is the introduction in the human population is estimated to be at the end of the 19th century. Even with correcting for the change in the age pyramid of several countries, such an epidemic of common cold turning into a very bad pneumopathia would have not gone unnoticed. Some thoughts that are not new but still essential, I guess, is the fact that, and especially here with this audience, that quantitative and evolutionary epidemiology are fields that are deeply rooted in theoretical population biology. So this is the same tools as we all use, and importantly, remind that every data analysis, everyone that is talking about this epidemic, whether it is wanted or not, relies on a model, and those models can if they are not quantitative, they are hardly cannot be manipulable or refutable easily. So that's why the quantitative modeling creates a ground of comparison and scientific discussion that is still required, in my opinion. And I really advocate for an ongoing, a growing dialogue between modeling field and clinic to stimulate the infection disease research. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mircea. Well, for those of you who may know the conditions in terms of the physical conditions and the support conditions in which all this work has been developed, so this is amazing, and I think that this shows a group of extremely brilliant individuals who do even more brilliant work when working together. So I rapidly then for a question of Christophe Bruno, if I so please if you can then speak aloud, Christophe.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant talk. Thank you very much. Very interesting, very clear. You will know about these approaches where you use environmental samples and you measure by quantitative RT-PCR the virus RNA in wastewater that is used in many countries now, and that is developed also in France, and which is sort of promised to be predictive for the development of the local virus load in the population. I was wondering if you have thought of integrating these data into your models, and if it would really be predictive for the changes in the virus load in the population.
Yes, thank you for this question. In fact, I discussed with a company that is doing this with the wastewater in the Bassin d'Houtot near Sète. First of all, the thing is the data are not publicly available. First of all, we don't have them, we cannot integrate them for now. They are quite noisy. It's quite difficult to extract a signal very recently. We have this is the same problem with the weather. That is, it's interesting when you have 2 weeks, for example, of data, so that you can smooth out, and then you have a signal that this is approximately the same time. You have to wait for having the same information from hospital data. The other thing is that it's difficult to quantify the viral load in the whole population without knowing the population itself, how many people are there, because for example, that was the problem for Sète. In sunny weekends, people are coming to their residential house. There are many more people, and then there is an increase because there are many people creating wastewater, potentially infected. So that it's difficult to normalize by a fluctuating number that is a node. So that I think that depends on the setting, in fact.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Then we have a technical question coming from Bernard Cassel about the novelty, I guess, of the memory. So Bernard, if you want to then to speak out on your question, please.
Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So thank you, Mircea, for this impressive panorama. My point was just to say that in your model, so in the classical model, you can use Erlang distributions to mimic some sort of gamma waiting time in different classes of the model. So it's possible. So I'm sure that if you have used that, the result that you present for the Markovian model will be better than.
Yeah, exactly. So this is true. When we add several stages, we can the sum of exponentially distributed variables follows Erlang distribution, even gamma if it's a non-discrete number, but it's still an Erlang distribution, while all clinical medical studies always provide results inference in terms of either gamma or wide or log normal. So first of all, it's less flexible, and well, this is it's straightforward. I mean, the number of classes is only determined by the for example, the 99% quantile of the distribution, but not bad by the number of the number of compartments needed to converge to a good approximation in terms of error distribution. But I know that other teams use this trick with 40 E compartments in a row. This is true, yes.
I think so. Then I would ask them, Mircea, because I guess that most people may be afraid of asking questions. My question is here: have we learned something? So, given that time and money are limited, and given, for instance, that the time and money investment in the UK, in terms, for instance, of sequencing, so while compared to that in France, which has been much less money, and then essentially much less freedom of access to the data that have been generated at the hospital. And then not only whether we have learned something, but can we tell something of what is an optimal strategy for gathering information? So what should we have been doing in terms of gathering information? So is there a differential in gain of success at managing the pandemic in the UK, given the investment in sequencing, compared to France, given the lack of investment in sequencing?
Well, the question is, if the money didn't go to sequencing, where did it go? This is true. I mean, not only the fact that we don't have sequences, but as well we don't have, for example, contact tracing done on a random basis. It's always done if at any time there was a systematic field epidemiology work focused on one town, for example, with compared to another town with different measures. That was never done. For example, this would have been completely a complete game changer. For example, let's take one town in Finistère in Brittany and open it, because the virus spread at very low incidence there, and see what's going on if you test every 2 or 3 days all the population, and you see the impact of measures on the whole town, for example, the city. So yes, I mean the sequences was required at the beginning to see, well, was it spreading on its own from is it communitary spread, that means in the general population, or is it importations from abroad? And then for the variants, for sure, to know what we see, are there hitchhiking, for example, processes, or allele surfing events, or is it really something that can be attributed to higher transmission? This question can also this potential can also address questions like higher lethality as well. But well, I would say that yes, the problem is not really where to allocate the money, but allocate it first of all. Another thing what that was pointed out by other studies was the investment in education and pedagogy towards elementary virology and epidemiology. The countries that focused on this, it has been shown that this is a high yield measure because it does not cost much. But if people understand why they are doing this, they feel involved then the gain in transmission prevention is quite interesting. So there is not only ongoing research that is important, but also outreach in a certain measure, because otherwise we are not creating adhesion involvement of the population on this. We cannot rely only on understanding the epidemic. There is also some prevention to make in the population.
Thank you very much. I think we have went well over the time we had allocated to ourselves. So I have to. I say once again, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the work. Thanks to the ETE team, and then so thanks a lot also for accepting the invitation.
I really thank you for everything, all the organizers, for this great meeting, and I hope we'll not have to discuss much about the COVID-19 in the next month.
I hope there will not be another session in May 22. I hope. Okay, so thank you very much, and then we'll meet then next week on next Friday for our next seminar. Okay, goodbye. Enjoy the weekend. Bye.
Thank you all.